This was shot on a new camera by Insta360 and Beta FPV called the SMO 4K. It's a Naked Insta360 1R in a custom injection molded case, and it's ready to fly. It weighs 30 grams, and it's got a built-in speaker, mic, and BEC that'll take up to a 6S battery. Up to this point, we've been tearing apart GoPros to get at the main board and camera sensor and enclosing them in a case like this. It's not for the faint of heart, as it requires ripping into a GoPro and potentially damaging it. So now we've got this, which is basically the same concept but ready to go out of the box. It comes with a clear lens protector, an extra backplate which excludes this little mounting nub, an ND16 filter, a screwdriver, and some wires to solder to your flight controller. They also sent me this adapter that'll take the Naked GoPro connector. And finally, the microSD slot is on the side. So let's take a look at the internals. Typically, to make a Naked GoPro, we attach a BEC to the main board to supply the 5 volts of power it needs, but these have been kind of problematic. They've been known to fail and even damage the GoPro. So what we've got here is a little different. It's got a custom control board with buttons, a BEC, and Wi-Fi and Bluetooth module. It's connected to the camera board via a ribbon cable, and it's got a mic as well as a speaker. And up front on the second board, we've got the Ambarella H22 4K processor. So let's see how it works. It's got a chime when you turn it on, a beep when you start recording, and a beep and a chime when you stop recording. Long press to turn it off, and it's got a shutdown chime as well. To connect to your phone, you need the Insta360 1R app and both Bluetooth and Wi-Fi turned on. You may need to manually connect to the Wi-Fi network at first, and the password is a series of 8 8s. You may also need to update the camera firmware. It supports up to 4K at 60 frames per second at 16:9 and 4:3, and it also supports 2.7K at 100 frames per second and 1080p at 200 frames per second. It's got 4 field of view modes, but I only really recommend wide angle. It's got 3 color modes, and I think standard looks the best. You've also got HDR, time-lapse, and time shift. And unfortunately, there aren't a lot of manual settings. This is Insta360 Studio, and it's important that you run your footage through this because the MP4 files on your card won't be stabilized without it. You need to make sure flow state stabilization is enabled, otherwise your footage will look like this. There's a new FPV FOV option available, which stretches the footage to give the impression of speed, I guess. It's debatable whether or not it looks better than ultra-wide, but at least you have the choice. One thing to point out is that this camera doesn't support keyframes, flips, rolls, or any of that fun stuff available on the Insta360 Go. This is strictly a 4K camera, so no fancy 360 features. What you can do is trim the video and add speed ramps to increase or slow down the speed of the video. I wouldn't go more than half on 60 frames per second though. When you export, you can choose the frame rate, encoding format, and apply color plus and remove grain. The export times vary and depend on your computer speed. Sometimes it can take several minutes. To mount it to a Beta 95X V2, you need this little 3D printed mount, and it's a good idea to add an M2 nut to both sides to get it tight. It's not the easiest to mount, and you probably won't want to take it on and off, but it gets the job done. And the angle adjusts from about 10 to 25 degrees. It weighs in at 160 grams dry, and with a 4S 550 mAh battery, it weighs 228 grams. Now let's put the microSD card in and get some footage. This is 4K 60 at 16:9 with flow state stabilization in FPV mode. I exported once with Color Plus and again without it. Here's what it looks like with Color Plus. And here it is again without it. With and without. I'm not really sure which I like better, so I guess it depends on your footage. You can always export both and see which looks better. At least when you do this, you have a choice. If you enable Vivid on the camera, you're stuck with it. Now here, I've got a Naked GoPro Hero 6 using Real Steady Go compared to the SMO 4K using Flow State. Both are recorded in 4K, but the GoPro is only 30 frames per second, while the SMO is 60. The GoPro is on GoPro color mode, and the SMO is set to standard. Here I've got the SMO in FPV mode, which tends to stretch the sides a bit, just like Real Steady Go. And here it is in ultra-wide mode. The distortion is more or less gone. I've heard a lot of people complain about the stretching that occurs in Real Steady Go, so with the SMO, at least you've got a choice. Now, whether or not flow state stabilization is as good as Real Steady Go is up for debate. Personally, I still think Real Steady Go gives a much smoother result. Also, you have the option to lock the horizon in Real Steady Go, which is not available using flow state on this camera. And for one last test, I taped it to the top of my GoPro Hero 8. Here I've got the GoPro Hero 8 on 4K 60 with Hypersmooth 2.0. So let's see how Hypersmooth compares to flow state. One thing worth pointing out is that I've got the GoPro on medium sharpness, which is a popular choice for FPV. The SMO 4K doesn't have a sharpness setting, and I find the footage a little too sharp. Now, I'm sure it can be de-sharpened in post, but not all video editors have that feature. Since both of these cameras have a mic, let's take a listen. Here's the GoPro mic. And here's the SMO 4K mic. The Hero 8 seems to have much richer sound, but I never really use flight audio. Personally, I prefer the color and image quality of the Hero 8, but I prefer flow state to Hypersmooth. The nice thing about GoPro though is you can always use Real Steady Go, but that's an additional expense. The SMO 4K is a great value when you take all the costs into consideration, plus you can fly it on a sub 250 gram rig without the trouble of tearing apart a GoPro. Finally, let's take a look at 2.7K at 100 frames per second. It seems to get cropped quite a bit and you lose FPV mode. When you open this up in Insta360 Studio, it automatically applies a 1/4 speed time shift to the entire clip. Then your only export options are 25, 50, and 100 frames per second. What I did here was remove the time shift and export it at 100 frames per second in real time. Then I reduced the speed to 30% in DaVinci Resolve. It's not as good as GoPro's 120 frames per second at 2.7K, but you can get some serviceable slow motion footage. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed the video. Please subscribe for more FPV related content and drop a like. Thank you. Bye.